Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. Each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I seek to provide a brief introduction to two of the upcoming assigned Bible readings for Sunday. In this video, we're going to look at Ezekiel 17, 22 to 24, the lesson assigned as the Old Testament reading for Sunday, June 10th, 2021. Before looking at our assigned reading from Ezekiel, it is good to have a little background and introduction into this major prophet of Israel. From the Lutheran Study Bible, while in captivity in Babylon, Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, and an Israelite priest, possibly a descendant of Zadok, prophesied to his fellow exiles. Little is known of the details of his life other than that his wife died while he was in exile. His prophetic activity began in 593 BCE and extended at least to 571 BCE. Like Jeremiah, Ezekiel prophesied before and after the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 587 BCE. Ezekiel is a major prophet because you can see the time that he worked covered almost 22 years. Most of us have been raised with religion and politics need to be held separate. But when it comes to the Old Testament, there's no escaping the religious and political implications addressed by the prophets. If you spend time reading 1 Kings and 2 Kings or 1 and 2 Chronicles in the Old Testament, we'll read how those in positions of leadership and power believed to be anointed by God led either in the direction that was right in the eyes of God or wrong. The kings who kept a spirit of humility and devotion to Yahweh were rare in comparison to the kings who consistently sought to negotiate economic, military, and political alliances, which often came at the expense of keeping God at the center of the life of Israel and Judah, and which led to idolatry and exploitation of the vulnerable. Again, from the Lutheran Study Bible. Many of Ezekiel's prophecies are dated and flow chronologically, providing a historical backbone to the book. There are four primary sections in Ezekiel. Judgments against Jerusalem and Israel, chapters 1 through 24. Judgments against foreign nations, chapters 25 to 32. Promises of restoration, chapters 33 to 39. A vision of a reestablished temple and order in Jerusalem and Israel, chapters 40 to 48. Ezekiel boldly confronts Israel's unfaithfulness and idolatry and emphasizes absolute holiness of the Lord. Set in the hopelessness of exile, the book is a swirl of scolding judgments, mind-blowing visions, and hopeful promises, all of which have inspired the creative imagination of Christian writers throughout the centuries, including those who have written a number of African American spirituals. Against any attempt to tame God, the book of Ezekiel is a testimony that God is holy beyond our understanding and control. Let's look at our lesson. Ezekiel 17, 22 to 24. Before unpacking our Old Testament reading, we need to remember it is in the first section of Ezekiel pertaining to judgments against Jerusalem and Israel in chapters 1 to 24. I'd like to read this brief lesson and then walk through it. Thus says the Lord God, I myself will take a sprig from the lofty top of a cedar. I will set it out. I'll break off a tender one from the topmost of its young twigs. I myself will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. On the mountain height of Israel, I'll plant it in order that it may produce boughs and bear fruit and become a noble cedar. Under it, every kind of bird will live. In the shade of its branches will nest winged creatures of every kind. All the trees of the field shall know that I am the Lord. I bring low the high tree, I make high the low tree, I dry up the green tree and make the dry tree flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will accomplish it. If you have time, I encourage you to read chapter 16 prior to our lesson. Ezekiel describes God's relationship with Jerusalem as a lover who has courted his bride, only to discover after gaining her commitment to join in the marriage covenant, the beloved bride takes on foreign lovers. If you or someone you know has ever experienced the violation of their marriage vows or bed, you know the feelings that come through such betrayal. The amazing thing in Ezekiel is in chapter 16, verses 59 to 63, God, the lover of Israel and Jerusalem, is willing to forgive and reestablish a new covenant. Ezekiel 17, 1 to 10 is a riddle and an allegory about two eagles and a vine. The first eagle is the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and the other eagle is the Pharaoh of Egypt, Psammetichus II. The vine is Judah's king Zedekiah, who chose not to listen to God and shifted his allegiance from Babylon to Egypt, leading to dire consequences to his country, his family, and himself. 17 verse 21. All the pick of his troops shall fall by the sword, and the survivors shall be scattered to every wind. And you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken. This is the context of our prophecy or our reading for this Sunday. We have God, the bridegroom, being married to Israel, Judah, the bride in Jerusalem, and the bride has been unfaithful. God has been unwilling to forgive. Then we have a little story of an alliance made between two different kings that end poorly for the one that was anointed by God, Zedekiah. So let's go into our lesson. Verse 22. Thus says the Lord, I myself will take a sprig from the lofty top of a cedar. I will set out, I will break off a tender one from the topmost of its young twigs. I myself will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. As you read this verse, note who is the only one who can restore what has happened to Judah and Jerusalem. We read I myself 2 times and I 1 time in just one verse. When human leaders fail, where do we turn? Ezekiel's trying to get his audience to learn God is the only one that can restore, rebuild, and return the people of Judah and Israel back to becoming the blessing God intended them to be to the world. The language used is filled with clues to how God will do what God plans to do. A sprig is a descendant of Jehoiakim. A lofty mountain is Jerusalem. When you plant a tree, what is the expectation for that tree? Verse 23. On the mountain height of Israel, I will plant it in order that it may produce boughs and bear fruit and become a noble cedar. Under it, every kind of bird will live. In the shade of its branches will nested winged creatures of every queen. Will nest winged creatures of every kind. A noble cedar is a mighty ruler whose branches or descendants will shelter every kind of bird, which means other countries. Verse 24, all the trees of the field shall know that I am the Lord. I bring low the high tree, I make high the low tree, I dry up the green tree and make the dry tree flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will accomplish it. By this planting project by God, God will be the one who will bring the high and mighty low, and the prosperous and the powerful who present themselves as superior to others will see a reversal. Why? So that all might know that Yahweh is the Lord of the nations. Some believe that King Jehoiakim's grandson, Zerubbabel, was just such a tree who might be used by God to restore the Davidic monarchy. Zerubbabel was an early leader of exiles returning to Jerusalem under King Cyrus's edict, and he oversaw the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. He was highly regarded and considered an ancestor of Jesus. The temple he built was significantly smaller than King Solomon's, but it was still standing 500 years later when Jesus arrived on the scene. As you meditate on these few verses out of Ezekiel, remember who's the one that ultimately is acting: God. And remember that God will not let his name remain unholy. May we listen to the prophet, and may we trust that God is able to forgive, and God is able to work through very imperfect people to accomplish what God has always intended. That God's people be a blessing, they bear fruit, they provide shelter for all the birds of every kind. God bless.